in the grand halls of Versailles, where golden mirrors once gleamed with the triumphs of an absolute monarchy, another reflection began to take shape by 1774, one of decay, corruption, and the crushing weight of human frailty. The king who had come to be known as Louis the Well-Beloved would eventually meet his end as Louis the Hated. His body was ravaged not just by illness, but by the very rot of his own reign. This is the story of how a king's moral decay mirrored his physical demise, and how his decomposing body became a powerful symbol of a monarchy already crumbling from within. Louis XV's reign is a stark example of a dramatic reversal of fortune, a cautionary tale of unchecked power and abandoned responsibility. When smallpox finally claimed his life in May 1774, it did so with a brutality so severe that even his most loyal servants fled from the stench of his rotting flesh. Yet, this gruesome end was merely the final chapter of a decades-long tragedy that set the stage for one of the most devastating revolutions in history. To truly understand the horror of Louis XV's death, we must first trace the rise of the young monarch, who, with promise and potential, would fall into becoming one of France's most despised rulers. His story doesn't start with the frail king on his deathbed, but with a 5-year-old boy suddenly thrust into the world of politics and power, an innocent child who would eventually embody the moral and physical collapse of a nation. The year 1715 marked both an end and a beginning for France. Louis XIV, the Sun King, whose reign had spanned an extraordinary 72 years, passed away, leaving behind a legacy of unmatched authority and a crushing national debt. His successor, the 5-year-old great-grandson Louis XV, inherited not just the crown but the weight of a nation that had known no other ruler for nearly 3/4 of a century. Tragically, the boy had already lost both parents to disease, making him an orphan before he could fully grasp the enormity of his new responsibility. During his childhood, France was governed by a regency led by Philippe d'Orléans, a time marked by moderate reform and economic recovery from the financial ruin caused by Louis XIV's costly wars. The young king was given an excellent education. His tutors praised his sharp intellect and ability to grasp subjects such as history, languages, mathematics, and even the intricacies of war and diplomacy. The French court and people saw hope in their young ruler, believing he might usher in a new golden age for the nation. When Louis XV finally assumed power in 1723, the French people truly adored him. He was handsome, intelligent, and full of promise, embodying the hope of a nation weary from the harsh final years of Louis XIV. His reign began with such optimism that the people affectionately called him Louis le Bien-Aimé, Louis the Well-Beloved. For many, this nickname was given out of genuine affection, reflecting the widespread hope that his rule would bring reform, prosperity, and a break from the outdated practices of his grandfather. In his early years as king, Louis XV seemed to live up to the expectations. He married Marie Leszczyńska, the daughter of a deposed Polish king, in a ceremony that further solidified France's position in European politics. The marriage appeared to be one of true affection, and the queen quickly provided the monarchy with heirs, ensuring the continuation of the royal line. Louis XV also displayed an interest in the sciences and the arts, supporting philosophers and inventors, and maintaining France's reputation as the cultural hub of Europe. However, even during these promising years, signs of trouble began to emerge. Louis XV began to show an unsettling tendency toward indecisiveness, and his increasing reliance on mistresses and favourites for political advice raised concerns. Unlike Louis XIV, who had built an image of divine authority and personal discipline, Louis XV seemed more interested in pleasure than in the burdens of kingship. His court, once seen as a symbol of elegance and grandeur, began to gain a reputation for scandalous libertinism, one that would only worsen over time. The gradual shift from beloved king to despised ruler didn't happen overnight. It unfolded through a series of scandals, failures, and decisions that weakened the trust of the French people. Each crisis revealed more of Louis XV's inability to provide the strong, decisive leadership that France so desperately needed. What began as a reign full of promise would slowly descend into a nightmare of military defeat, financial ruin, and moral corruption, ultimately consuming not only the king himself, but the very institution of monarchy in France. The first significant test of Louis XV's reign came with the War of the Austrian Succession, which began in 1740 and lasted for 8 brutal years. France entered the conflict to counter British influence and support its ally, Prussia. However, the war exposed the deep flaws in Louis XV's leadership. Unlike the well-planned campaigns of his grandfather, Louis XV's military endeavours lacked clear objectives or coherent strategy, reflecting his growing uncertainty and the dysfunction within his government. The war drained France's finances, requiring heavy taxes and loans that plunged the country deeper into debt. The once mighty French military suffered humiliating defeats and lost several key territories. Even more troubling was Louis XV's personal involvement in the war. Though he occasionally led troops in battle, earning him fleeting popularity, his leadership proved ineffective. His decisions seemed to be more influenced by court intrigue and personal connections than by sound military strategy. During this period, Louis XV's marriage began to unravel, as he grew more involved with a string of mistresses. The most influential of these was Madame de Pompadour, who not only became the king's lover, but also his trusted political advisor. This arrangement shocked both the French court and the public, who saw it as a sign of the king's moral decay and poor judgment. The growing influence of these royal mistresses on government policy stirred constant criticism, undermining the monarchy's credibility and its ability to govern effectively. The War of Austrian Succession finally ended in 1748 with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. However, the agreement returned most of the conquered territories to their original owners, despite France's immense sacrifices. The French people were furious, feeling that their sons had died in vain while their taxes had been wasted on a pointless war. This marked the beginning of a significant shift in public opinion as the nickname "well-beloved" started to lose its meaning, now ringing hollow to a more disillusioned populace. In response to mounting criticism, Louis XV withdrew further into his own world, surrounding himself with a small circle of advisors who only told him what he wanted to hear. This detachment from reality became a defining feature of his later reign, as he became increasingly unable to comprehend or address the real issues facing his people. The divide between the opulent world of Versailles and the harsh realities of everyday life for the French citizens grew even wider throughout the 1750s. But perhaps more damaging than military losses was the growing perception that Louis XV cared more about his own pleasures than the well-being of his kingdom. Stories of his extravagant spending on mistresses and favourites spread across the country. While some of these tales were exaggerated, there was enough truth to stoke public resentment. One of the most notorious symbols of his priorities was the construction of the Petit Trianon, a lavish private retreat for Madame de Pompadour, seen by many as an example of personal indulgence trumping royal duty. The 7 Years' War, which began in 1756, turned out to be an even greater disaster than the previous conflict. France was pitted against Britain and Prussia in a battle for colonial supremacy and European dominance. From the start, French forces were outclassed by their enemies. The loss of nearly all of France's North American colonies, including Canada and Louisiana, was a national humiliation that Louis XV could never escape. As France's global empire crumbled, the king seemed more concerned with his personal affairs than with defending French interests, deepening the public's frustration. The financial strain of prolonged warfare pushed France to the brink of bankruptcy. To cover the costs, new taxes were imposed, most heavily affecting the common people, while the nobility and clergy remained exempt. This unfair tax system fueled resentment not only against the monarchy, but also against the privileged classes. Louis XV's failure to push through meaningful financial reforms, due in large part to resistance from entrenched interests and his own lack of political will, ensured that France's financial problems would only worsen. By the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, the transformation of Louis XV from well-beloved to widely despised was complete. The Treaty of Paris, which ended the conflict, stripped France of much of its colonial empire and reduced it to a second-rate power. The king, once a beacon of hope for renewal, had become a symbol of national decline and disgrace. This shift laid the groundwork for the revolutionary sentiments that would eventually bring down the monarchy, though few could have foreseen how absolute that destruction would be. In the years following the war, Louis XV withdrew even further into a world of indulgence. While France grappled with growing issues that demanded strong leadership, the king's daily routine became increasingly detached from the needs of governance. His time was spent hunting, entertaining mistresses, and participating in elaborate court rituals, all of which seemed increasingly irrelevant to the suffering masses. This disconnection between the royal luxury of Versailles and the hardships faced by ordinary French citizens became a central theme in the growing criticisms of his reign. The influence of royal mistresses on policy reached its peak during this period, particularly with Madame de Pompadour and later Madame du Barry. These women were no longer just companions, they played active roles in making key decisions on war, diplomacy and domestic affairs. This sparked outrage among both the traditional nobility, who felt sidelined, and the common people, who saw it as a glaring example of corruption and moral decay. The spectacle of high-ranking government positions being handed out based on sexual favour rather than merit severely damaged confidence in the monarchy. Religious tensions also took a toll on Louis XV's popularity during this time. His decision to expel the Jesuits from France in 1764, while welcomed by some, alienated traditional Catholic supporters of the monarchy. His behaviour, compounded by the influence of his mistresses, scandalised devout Catholics, who saw his actions as incompatible with his role as the eldest son of the Church. This religious criticism added another layer of damage to his reputation, undermining one of the core sources of his royal legitimacy. Economic issues that had plagued France since the beginning of Louis XV's reign continued to worsen throughout the 1760s. Despite several attempts at reform by finance ministers like Silhouette and Turgot, the root causes of the crisis remained unaddressed. The tax system stayed inequitable, the national debt continued to balloon, and outdated regulations and privileges stifled economic growth. Louis XV's apparent indifference to the pressing issues of his time only worsened his reputation among the rising middle class and reform-minded nobility, who saw economic reform as essential for France's future. Social unrest became more frequent, as food shortages and economic hardships led to riots and protests across the country. The government's response was predictably heavy-handed, using military force instead of addressing the root causes of the unrest. This approach only deepened the resentment toward the monarchy and reinforced the growing belief that Louis XV was out of touch with his people's suffering. The king, once seen as a father figure, was now viewed as an oppressor. Meanwhile, the Enlightenment movement, led by thinkers like Voltaire, Diderot and Rousseau, challenged the foundation of absolute monarchy and divine right that had long underpinned royal power. Though these ideas initially gained traction among the educated elite, they gradually spread to broader segments of French society. Louis XV's personal behaviour and his reign's failures provided perfect examples of the corruption and inefficiency that Enlightenment thinkers associated with absolute monarchy. The king's attempts to silence criticism through censorship and persecution only fueled public curiosity about these forbidden ideas, further tarnishing his image as a tyrant. The infamous 1757 assassination attempt by Damiens, who tried to kill Louis XV, highlighted the extent of public hostility toward the king. Though the attack failed and Damiens was punished, his actions and subsequent trial revealed that even attempts on the king's life could be met with sympathy from the French people, who saw his reign as a symbol of oppression. Internationally, Louis XV's reign was marked by a string of humiliations, especially after the end of major wars. France's failure to prevent the partition of Poland, despite long-standing ties with the country, further damaged the monarchy's prestige. The king's foreign policy appeared reactive, responding to events rather than shaping them. This perception of weakness in international affairs fed into domestic criticisms of his leadership and contributed to France's declining influence among European powers. By the late 1760s, the gap between the monarchy and its people had grown dangerously wide. Louis XV ruled over a population that had lost faith in his ability to govern or even care about their welfare. The economic, social and political issues that would later explode into revolution were already visible, yet the king seemed either unwilling or incapable of addressing them. The stage was set for the final tragic chapter of his reign. The 1770s began with France still burdened by the accumulated problems of the Louis XV's reign. The national debt had reached staggering levels, and the king's repeated appointments of finance ministers promising reform, only to abandon them when faced with resistance, became a familiar, futile cycle. Social tensions reached new heights, with food shortages leading to bread riots in major cities, while the tax burden continued to fall most heavily on the poor. Meanwhile, the nobility and clergy exempt from these taxes grew more powerful, deepening the divide. The contrast between the lavish life at court and the suffering of the people could no longer be ignored. Stories of royal excess, though often exaggerated, spread through France, further fueling resentment. Louis XV's personal life, particularly his relationship with Madame du Barry, a woman of low birth, became even more scandalous. Unlike previous royal mistresses, who at least maintained some dignity, Madame du Barry's crude and mercenary behaviour became a symbol of the monarchy's moral decay. To many, she represented the king's complete abandonment of his royal responsibilities. Religious opposition to Louis XV also grew during this period. His support for dissolving religious orders and his personal conduct alienated many traditional Catholic supporters of the monarchy. The conflict between the monarchy and the Parliament of Paris over religious and political matters eventually led to a constitutional crisis. Louis XV's decision to exile the Parliament and replace it with more compliant courts only deepened criticisms of his authoritarianism without resolving any of the underlying issues. Meanwhile, the influence of Enlightenment ideas continued to spread across French society. Works that questioned royal authority and proposed alternative forms of government found increasing acceptance among the educated classes. Louis XV's personal failures and policy missteps were perfect examples for these writers of the dangers of unchecked royal power. Internationally, France's diplomatic power continued to decline. Louis XV's foreign policy, often driven by personal relationships and court intrigue rather than coherent national interests, led to several diplomatic defeats. These continued failures further reinforced perceptions of royal incompetence and the weakness of France's global standing. By the early 1770s, Louis XV's health began to noticeably decline, though he continued to keep up with his exhausting schedule of hunting and court ceremonies. Observers of the time noted that he seemed increasingly fatigued and aged, perhaps due to the accumulated stress from years of criticism and failure. But even though his decline was evident, few could have predicted the horrific and symbolically fitting end that awaited him. During this period, public opinion increasingly turned against the monarchy, with songs, pamphlets, and satirical literature mocking Louis XV's reign. Despite efforts to suppress these works, they spread throughout the country, depicting the king as a weak, corrupt, and overly indulgent ruler who had betrayed his people. The king, once celebrated in art and literature as a symbol of French greatness, had become a figure of ridicule and contempt. The cumulative effect of these issues created a revolutionary climate in France. Although the revolution itself wouldn't begin until after Louis XV's death, the monarchy had already lost its legitimacy in the eyes of the people. The government was bankrupt and unable to function, and social tensions were at a breaking point. All it would take was a spark to ignite the explosion that would destroy the old order. In April 1774, while staying at the Petit Trianon with Madame du Barry, Louis XV began feeling unwell. What seemed like a minor illness soon turned into something far more serious and ultimately fatal. The king experienced headaches, fever, and general malaise, symptoms that his doctors initially attributed to exhaustion. But within days, it became clear that something much more severe was at play, as his condition worsened despite medical treatment. By April 28th, the first signs of smallpox appeared when characteristic pustules began forming on his skin. Smallpox was one of the most feared diseases of the time, killing millions across Europe without mercy for either commoners or royalty. It had already taken the lives of several European royals, and its arrival at Versailles caused panic among the court. Those who could fled the palace in fear of the highly contagious and often fatal disease. Louis XV's doctors, led by Dr. Bordeaux and Dr. Lasson, were among the best of their time, but they were powerless against smallpox once it had taken hold. The medical knowledge of the era offered no effective treatments, and the king's physicians resorted to bloodletting, purging, and other methods that likely hastened his death. Their inability to help him added to the atmosphere of helplessness and dread that filled Versailles during his final days. The progression of the disease was shockingly rapid and severe, suggesting Louis had contracted a particularly virulent strain of smallpox. Within days, his entire body was covered in the painful pustules that made smallpox infamous. The lesions caused excruciating pain, and the king was often heard crying out in agony as they spread. The once handsome monarch was now a grotesque figure, and even his closest attendants found it difficult to look upon him. As the disease worsened, the pustules ruptured, releasing a foul-smelling discharge that made the king's chambers unbearable. The stench became so overwhelming that even servants, who had served the royal family for decades, began refusing to enter his rooms. The doctors themselves found it increasingly hard to stay near the king long enough to provide whatever care they could. The palace, once a symbol of royal magnificence, had transformed into a charnel house where death seemed to linger in every corridor. Perhaps the psychological toll on the king was even worse than the physical pain. Louis XV, who had always been vain about his appearance and deeply concerned with his royal dignity, was now forced to face his own mortality in the most humiliating way possible. The mirrors that had once reflected his handsome features now showed a face so disfigured and corrupt that he reportedly ordered them all removed from his chambers. The man who had ruled through the mystique of royal majesty was now reduced to a rotting corpse, still alive but barely hanging on. Court etiquette, which had governed every aspect of life at Versailles for over a century, began to unravel as the reality of the king's condition became impossible to ignore. The grand ceremonies that had once defined royal life were abandoned as courtiers fled in fear of infection. Even the most basic functions of the royal court faltered, as servants either abandoned their posts or became ill themselves. The rigid hierarchy of Versailles collapsed in the face of disease and death. Madame du Barry, who had been the king's constant companion for years, was forced to leave Versailles under orders from the royal family. Her presence was seen as both a source of infection and a scandal. Her departure left Louis XV even more isolated in his final moments, surrounded only by a small group of physicians and servants who stayed out of duty rather than choice. The woman who had wielded immense power over royal policy was now powerless to help the man who had elevated her to such heights. In his final days, Louis XV experienced moments of clarity, interspersed with delirium caused by fever and pain. During the times when he was lucid, the king reportedly expressed regret for his actions, seeking forgiveness from both God and his people. However, these moments of repentance were overshadowed by the horrific reality of his deteriorating condition, which worsened despite all medical efforts. The contrast between his spiritual anguish and the physical torment he endured created a scene of almost medieval horror, shocking even those familiar with the brutalities of 18th century life. On May 10, 1774, after nearly 2 weeks of agony, Louis XV succumbed to the smallpox that had ravaged his body. His death was both a relief and a horror to the few who remained at his bedside. Witnesses reported that the king's body convulsed violently before finally becoming still. The man who had once embodied absolute royal power died in conditions so degrading they would have been considered appalling for a common criminal. In the immediate aftermath of Louis XV's death, the collapse of respect and affection for the French monarchy became evident. Instead of the grand mourning rituals that usually followed a royal death, there was a sense of relief, even celebration, throughout much of France. In Paris, the news of his passing was met with cheers in the streets, while church bells that should have tolled in mourning remained silent. The king, who had once been adored as Louis the Well-Beloved, died largely unmourned and unloved by the majority of his subjects. The state of Louis XV's body posed immediate practical problems for the royal household and the government. Smallpox had so disfigured and corrupted his corpse that traditional funeral preparations were impossible. The stench from his chambers was so unbearable that even trained embalmers refused to work on his body for more than a few minutes at a time. The preparation of the king's body for burial had to be rushed, with many traditional procedures abandoned due to the state of decay. It was quickly decided to seal the king's body in a lead coffin and transport it directly to the royal burial ground at Saint-Denis. This departure from the usual protocol, which would have involved a public lying in state and elaborate funeral ceremonies, was justified on the grounds of public health. However, many saw it as a symbolic attempt to distance the monarchy from the embarrassing circumstances of the king's death and the failures of his reign. The funeral procession itself was a mockery of royal dignity, with few nobles willing to participate and crowds along the route more curious than respectful. The sealed coffin prevented the customary viewing of the royal remains, and the rushed nature of the proceedings gave the event an air of shameful necessity rather than solemn ceremony. Contemporary accounts describe the funeral as resembling more the disposal of waste than the burial of a monarch who had ruled France for nearly 6 decades. Even in death, Louis XV's body continued to cause problems for the monarchy. The sealed coffin couldn't entirely contain the stench of decay, making the funeral at Saint-Denis an ordeal for all present. Several participants reportedly fell ill during the ceremony, either from the infection or simply from the overwhelming odour. The bishop who conducted the service was forced to abbreviate the traditional rituals, breaking from precedent and further diminishing the dignity of the occasion. The symbolic impact of Louis XV's horrific death and undignified burial was not lost on contemporary observers. Many saw in his physical corruption a reflection of the moral decay that had plagued his reign. The contrast between the magnificent funeral of Louis XIV and the hasty, shameful burial of his successor highlighted the monarchy's decline and loss of popular support. Pamphlets and satirical songs quickly appeared, comparing the two kings and drawing unfavourable conclusions about the direction of royal leadership. The immediate succession of Louis XVI was overshadowed by the circumstances of his grandfather's death, as well as the urgent need to address the multiple crises facing France. The new king, only 20 years old and inexperienced in government, inherited not only the throne but the accumulated problems and resentments of Louis XV's reign. The horror of his predecessor's death served as a stark reminder of the vulnerability of royal power at a time when France desperately needed strong leadership. Internationally, reactions to Louis XV's death were mixed. Some European courts expressed formal condolences, while privately many saw France's loss of an ineffective ruler as potentially beneficial. The circumstances surrounding the king's final days became the subject of diplomatic gossip, further damaging France's already weakened international reputation. The monarchy that had once served as the model for absolutism across Europe had become an object of pity and scorn. Louis XV's death marked more than the end of a reign. It symbolised the complete collapse of the mystique and authority that had sustained absolute monarchy in France for over a century. His tragic and undignified death stripped away any remaining illusions about the divine nature of royal power, revealing the monarchy's fundamental weakness. The king who had ruled by divine right died like any other victim of disease, his body consumed by the same forces that affected the humblest of his subjects. The financial crisis Louis XV left behind for his successor was perhaps his most damaging legacy. The national debt had reached unsustainable levels, requiring immediate and drastic measures to avoid total government collapse. However, the political structures and social arrangements that had made reform impossible during Louis XV's reign remained unchanged, ensuring that Louis XVI would face the same obstacles that had defeated his predecessor. The monarchy's failure to address these fundamental economic problems would become one of the primary causes of the French Revolution. The social resentments that had built up during Louis XV's reign continued to fester, eventually exploding into revolution. After Louis XV's death, the deep-rooted issues of the French monarchy remained unresolved. The inequitable tax system, the privileges of the nobility and clergy, and the ever-growing divide between the rich and poor all persisted. The new king, Louis XVI, despite his good intentions and seeming commitment to reform, could not overcome the accumulated grievances of decades of misrule. The public's hatred, once directed at Louis XV personally, quickly shifted to the institution of the monarchy itself when conditions failed to improve under his successor. The international consequences of Louis XV's failures also lingered long after his death. The loss of France's colonial empire, the decline in diplomatic influence, and the perception of French weakness all severely hampered the country's ability to compete with rivals like Britain and Austria. Louis XV's attempt to restore France's standing by supporting the American Revolution only worsened the financial crisis while failing to bring any lasting diplomatic benefits. The momentum of decline that had begun under Louis XV proved impossible to reverse. The intellectual and cultural changes that had taken place during Louis XV's reign also had profound long-term effects. Enlightenment critiques of absolute monarchy had gained widespread support among educated French citizens, creating a body of opinion fundamentally hostile to royal authority. The monarchy's loss of moral legitimacy couldn't be restored by simply changing rulers. These issues were systemic, not personal. By 1774, the ideas that would justify revolution were already deeply embedded in French political culture. The administrative and governmental weaknesses exposed during Louis XV's reign continued to trouble his successor. The conflict between royal authority and traditional privileges, the inefficiency of the tax system, and the resistance to reform by vested interests all remained unchanged. Louis XV's attempts at reform were constantly undermined by the same forces that had thwarted his predecessors. The very structures that had once made France the most powerful state in Europe had become obstacles to effective governance. The symbolic impact of Louis XV's death continued to resonate throughout the final years of the old regime. His death, marked by agony and corruption, became a powerful metaphor for the decay of the entire social and political system. Revolutionary propaganda would later use the circumstances of his death to argue that the monarchy was inherently corrupt and beyond redemption. The horror of the king's final days became a central part of the revolutionary mythology that justified the total destruction of the old order. The public celebration of Louis XV's death also had profound implications for the monarchy's future. The fact that the French people could openly rejoice at their king's passing without facing significant consequences highlighted the weakness of royal authority and the depth of popular discontent. This breakdown in the traditional relationship between ruler and subjects would make it easier for revolutionary leaders to mobilize support against Louis XVI when the crisis finally arrived. The medical and scientific aspects of Louis XV's death further contributed to the demystification of royal authority. The detailed accounts of the king's suffering and physical decay provided stark evidence that monarchs, like anyone else, were subject to the same natural laws. This realization undermined one of the fundamental tenets of absolute monarchy, the belief that kings were somehow different from and superior to their subjects. The democratic nature of disease became a powerful argument for the equality of all human beings. The transformation of Louis XV from well-beloved to hated tyrant serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power and the importance of responsive governance. His reign showed that royal authority, built only on tradition and force, is inherently unstable and cannot survive without popular support. The lessons from his failure would influence political theorists and reformers across Europe, contributing to the broader movement toward constitutional government and popular sovereignty in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Louis XV's reign stands as one of history's most dramatic reversals of fortune, a devastating example of how personal failings and systemic issues can destroy even the most powerful institutions. His transformation from a beloved child king to a despised ruler reveals the fragility of political legitimacy and the dangers of unchecked power. The circumstances of his death, rotting away while his people celebrated, provided a fitting conclusion to a reign that had begun to decay long before disease claimed the king's body. The horror of Louis XV's final days represents more than just a gruesome historical event. It embodies the physical manifestation of the moral and political corruption that had infected the entire French monarchy. The king's body, ravaged by smallpox and abandoned by all but a few loyal servants, became the perfect symbol of the kingdom itself, diseased, isolated, and nearing collapse. The stench that drove courtiers from the royal chambers mirrored the political rot that would soon consume the monarchy. The contrast between Louis XV's early promise and his ultimate failure offers profound insights into leadership and the responsibilities of power. The young king, once a beacon of hope for renewal, died as the architect of his nation's humiliation and an unwitting catalyst for revolution. His inability to rise above personal pleasure and political expedience in service to his people demonstrates the critical need for moral courage in leadership, regardless of the political system or historical period. The international consequences of Louis XV's reign and death also warrant reflection. His failures reshaped the balance of power in Europe and contributed to conflicts and instabilities that would persist well into the 19th century. The loss of France's colonial empire opened the door for British expansion, which would shape global politics for generations. The weakness of the monarchy under Louis XV encouraged more aggressive policies from other European powers. His reign highlights the self-destructive nature of systems that concentrate power without accountability. The absolute authority that had made France dominant under Louis XIV became a tool for humiliation under his successor. The monarchy's failure to reform or adapt to changing circumstances exposed the inherent vulnerability of any political system that resists change and disregards the legitimate concerns of its people. Louis XV's ignominious death haunted the final years of the old regime, providing powerful ammunition for revolutionary propaganda. The image of royal power literally rotting away became a central theme in revolutionary literature and art. It served as a stark reminder that no institution, regardless of its historical prestige or claim to divine right, can escape the consequences of its own failures. The king, abandoned and despised in his final moments, became an unintentional symbol of the need for political systems based on consent and accountability, rather than tradition and force. The lessons of Louis XV's reign remain relevant today, warning us about the dangers of unchecked power, unresponsive government, and the long-term effects of unresolved problems. His story demonstrates that even the most established institutions can collapse when they lose the confidence and support of those they are meant to serve. The horror of his death is a reminder that power without legitimacy is ultimately powerless, and those who rule must answer to the people they govern. In the end, Louis XV's legacy was not one of renewal or glory, but the revolution his failures made inevitable. The king who began his reign as a symbol of hope ended as the embodiment of everything wrong with the old order. His decaying corpse, hastily buried and quickly forgotten, marked not just the end of a disastrous reign, but the beginning of the end for absolute monarchy in France. The revolution that would overthrow his successor and reshape European politics forever was, in many ways, the direct consequence of Louis XV's failures and the perfect response to the corruption that his death so vividly symbolized.